Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into something today that I know a lot of you are really interested in, and that's how to lose fat and keep it off for good, without falling for all the crazy diet fads out there. And you guys sent in a really great resource for us to go through the book, Burn the Fat, Feed the Muscle. So our mission today is to kind of unpack that book and give you the real practical knowledge you can actually use.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I liked most about this book was how grounded the author's approach is, especially coming from a bodybuilding background, because bodybuilders, they're not just about getting big, right? They're masters at getting super lean while still holding on to all that muscle they've worked so hard for. And that's completely different from just like crashing your calories with a crazy diet, which can make you lose muscle and actually slow down your metabolism in the long run.
Right. And the author really makes a point of calling it a nutrition program, not a diet. And I think that change in mindset is really important. This isn't some temporary thing. It's about making changes you can stick with. So let's get into it. The book starts by talking about what's wrong with how most of us approach fat loss.
Yeah, and the big issue, according to the author, is that so many people are obsessed with these very low-calorie diets, the ones that basically starve you and promise super fast results.
Oh, yeah. We've all seen those. And, sometimes they do work, like you might see the number on the scale drop pretty quickly. But the book is pretty clear that this isn't usually a path to long-term success.
And it's really interesting why that is. The author explains that your body is incredibly smart. When you suddenly cut your calories way down, it senses like a potential famine situation, even if you're just trying to look good in a swimsuit.
Right, so it kicks into survival mode.
Exactly.
So instead of just burning fat for energy, your body gets really resourceful. It starts conserving energy as much as possible. And here's the key. It can actually start breaking down your muscle tissue for fuel. And that's obviously not what you want if you're trying to get leaner and healthier and have a faster metabolism.
Right, and that's really where the core idea of the book comes in. Burn the fat, feed the muscle. It's not just about what you eat, but about how smart nutrition and exercise go hand in hand. Combining the two is how you get that long-lasting fat loss.
So the basic idea still comes down to calories, right? To lose fat, you have to burn more calories than you take in. That's still the fundamental principle.
Absolutely. Yeah. The book talks about two ways you can create that calorie deficit. First, you can eat fewer calories, and second, you can burn more calories through exercise. But even though both are important, the author really highlights how actively burning calories through movement is like a really key part of being successful in the long term.
And, he's very upfront about something that a lot of the fitness industry doesn't really want to talk about, which is that while the concept of a calorie deficit might sound simple, actually sticking to it consistently is not easy. He cuts through all those lose 20 pounds in a week with no effort marketing claims.
Yeah, I appreciate that honesty. It sets realistic expectations from the start.
Definitely. Okay, so the book then goes into a chapter that's a little unexpected, especially since it doesn't involve food or going to the gym.
You're talking about goal setting, right? The author spends a whole section on really defining your goals before you even think about things like meal plans or workouts. He seems to see it as like a foundation that a lot of people skip over.
Exactly. And what's interesting is the analogy he uses. He says that trying to lose weight without clear goals is like a ship setting sail without a destination in mind. You might be headed in the right general direction, but you're probably going to drift off course and never actually get to where you really want to be. Just saying I want to lose weight isn't nearly as powerful as setting a specific target.
Right. And he goes on to introduce this 11-step formula for setting really powerful goals. We won't go into all 11 steps here, but the main takeaway for you guys listening is that specificity is super important. Instead of just saying, I want to lose weight, it's about thinking, okay, I want to lose 15 pounds of body fat by the end of July, and I'm going to track my progress every week using body fat measurements.
Right. And the author addresses a question that a lot of people have. Can you really gain a lot of muscle and lose a lot of fat at the same time? He says that while it's possible to make some progress in both areas, especially if you're just getting started with training or getting back into shape after a break, trying to do both aggressively at the same time is usually pretty inefficient for most people. And he points out that when you see those really dramatic transformations where people are like putting on tons of muscle and losing tons of fat simultaneously, there are often some specific factors at play. Maybe they're just getting back to where they used to be. They're genetically gifted in a way that most people aren't. Or let's be honest, maybe they're using performance-enhancing drugs.
Right.
It's important to keep those things in mind and have realistic expectations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about why those really low-calorie diets can backfire, how important it is to set clear goals, and why focusing on body composition rather than just scale weight is key. Now let's dive a little deeper into why those extreme diets are so problematic. The author talks a lot about what he calls the body's starvation response.
This is a really crucial concept for you guys listening to understand. As the book explains, your body has this incredible ability to slow down its metabolism and conserve energy when food is scarce. It's like an evolutionary adaptation that helped our ancestors survive through times when food wasn't readily available.
Right, back when they were hunter-gatherers and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
But here's the thing. Our bodies basically react the same way, whether we're actually facing a real food shortage or if we're just drastically cutting calories for a diet.
Right. Your body doesn't really differentiate between you actually starving and you just choosing to restrict your food intake severely.
Yeah. And the consequences of triggering this starvation response when you're on a very low-calorie diet without also exercising can be pretty significant. The book lists 5 major negative effects.
Okay, let's break those down for everyone.
All right, so the first one is that a huge chunk, like 40 to 50% of the weight you lose on those diets is actually lean tissue, which includes your muscle. It's not just water weight. It's actual muscle mass being broken down. Your body is basically eating its own muscle for energy.
Exactly. And when you factor in the initial water weight you lose, especially if you're cutting carbs, which we'll get to in a bit, up to 75% of that initial weight loss might not even be fat.
Wow. So that quick weight loss you see can be totally misleading.
Absolutely.
Okay, the second negative effect is that very low-calorie diets can actually mess with your body's fat-regulating enzymes. They can make the enzymes that store fat more active, which makes it easier to gain fat back later. And at the same time, they can make the enzymes that help you burn fat less active. So it's like you're training your body to be better at storing fat and worse at burning it.
Right. And then the third issue is that these diets can actually lower your output of thyroid hormone, specifically T3. Now, your thyroid plays a big role in controlling your metabolism. So when your T3 levels go down, your metabolism slows down and you burn fewer calories overall.
So you're losing muscle, your body's getting better at storing fat, and your metabolism's slowing down.
Exactly.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It's not a great combination. And then the fourth downside is that these kinds of diets actually increase your risk of rebound weight gain, which is when you gain back all the weight you lost and maybe even more once you start eating normally again.
And that's almost inevitable for most people because, let's face it, nobody can stay on a super restrictive diet forever. Eventually, you're going to start eating more, but because your metabolism is slower and you may have lost muscle, the amount of food that used to keep you at a stable weight might now make you gain weight.
Right. It's a really frustrating cycle to get caught in.
Totally. So the fifth and final negative effect the author highlights is that the whole concept of dieting as this temporary thing is just fundamentally flawed. The idea that you go on a diet and then at some point go off just sets you up for failure because you haven't really made lasting changes.
Yeah, totally. The book argues that true permanent fat loss isn't about some quick fix. It's about adopting healthy habits that you can stick with for life, you know? It's about eating good food consistently and then maybe making some small adjustments when you're specifically trying to lose fat, like eating a little bit less and moving your body more.
And he actually cautions against making those huge drastic cuts to your calories right off the bat. He says it's much better to start with a smaller deficit that you can actually manage and then gradually increase it if you need to. It's about working with your body, not shocking it into some kind of starvation response.
Yeah, absolutely. And the book really stresses that exercise should be a primary tool for burning fat, not just trying to starve it away with some crazy diet.
Right. Okay, so we understand why that super fast weight loss can be counterproductive. Now, let's talk about what a healthy pace for losing fat actually looks like.
Okay, so the author says you shouldn't be too aggressive with your weight loss goals. You know, even though losing more than 2 pounds in a week might sound tempting, he says it's very unlikely that all of that is fat. It often comes at the cost of losing some of your muscle, too.
Yeah. He even says that it's better to lose just 1 pound of pure body fat per week than to lose 2 pounds where half of that is muscle. You want that slow, steady progress so you can keep the fat off for good.
Right, it's about the long game.
Exactly. And this is in line with what a lot of bodybuilders aim for when they're preparing for competition, losing about 1 to 1.5 pounds of fat per week. It's not about those super fast results that you see in the ads. It's about making changes that last.
Right, and I think it's important for people to really shift their focus away from just that number on the scale.
Totally. The author talks about how you need to squash your preoccupation with scale weight.
Mm.
Especially if you're lifting weights and building muscle, the scale can be very misleading.
Absolutely. Someone can weigh the same, but have a lot less fat and a lot more muscle, which is a huge win even if the number on the scale hasn't changed.
Exactly. And the book also points out that those old school height and weight charts that a lot of people use to figure out their ideal weight are often inaccurate, especially for people who have more muscle mass than average.
Yeah.
Someone who is very muscular might weigh more than what those charts say is healthy, but their body fat percentage could be totally fine. So relying on those charts alone can be really discouraging. Okay, so if we're not just focused on the scale, how should we be measuring our progress? Well, the author introduces body fat testing as a much more accurate way to track how your body composition is actually changing.
Yeah, and he specifically talks about skin fold testing. You can get this done by a trained professional, or you can even do it yourself at home with a tool called calipers.
Right.
And while the accuracy of skin fold testing can vary a little bit, depending on who's taking the measurements and what method they're using, the author emphasizes that being consistent with your method is actually more important than getting a perfectly precise number every time.
Yeah.
So, if you're getting it done by a professional, try to go to the same person each time.
Okay. So the key takeaway there is to use the same technique and ideally the same person each time so you can get consistent readings over time. This lets you track whether your body fat percentage is going up or down, which is what really matters.
Exactly. And then the book walks you through how to actually calculate your fat weight and your lean body mass, or LBM, using your total body weight and your body fat percentage.
Right.
And he even provides an example to make it really clear.
Awesome. And once you know your lean body mass, you can actually calculate your true ideal weight based on the body fat percentage you're aiming for. The book provides a formula for this.
Yeah.
So instead of just focusing on some arbitrary number on the scale, you can set a much more personalized goal that actually takes your muscle mass into account.
It's much more about your overall body composition than just a number.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about setting goals, tracking progress, and understanding that setbacks are going to happen along the way. Now, what happens when we hit that dreaded plateau where our progress just seems to stall completely? The book offers some great advice for overcoming those plateaus.
Right. So the first thing he says is that, in general, you should be seeing some kind of positive change week to week, whether it's your weight going down, your body fat percentage dropping, or your measurements getting smaller. There should be some movement in the right direction.
Okay.
Now, if you go a whole week without any progress at all, he says the first thing to do is take a hard look at your habits.
Right.
Have you really been consistent with your program? Or have there been more slip-ups than you realize?
Right.
Maybe you've had a few extra snacks here and there, or you've missed a couple of workouts.
Yeah. We all do that sometimes.
Totally.
Okay, so if you've honestly been following your plan, allowing for those occasional planned cheat meals, of course,
Yeah.
and you're still not seeing results, that's when you need to think about making adjustments. You've got to shake things up to get things moving again.
Exactly. And the book stresses the importance of staying positive during these times. It's easy to get discouraged when you feel like you're working hard and not seeing the scale move. But he says to focus on your long-term goals, not just the day-to-day fluctuations.
Right.
And instead of seeing it as a failure, he says to try to view that lack of progress as valuable feedback.
Okay, like what can you learn from it?
Yeah, exactly. He even quotes Thomas Edison, who famously said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work."
Oh, I love that quote.
It's a great one. And the book talks about the difference between people who ultimately succeed by pushing through those plateaus and the people who get frustrated and give up. The people who make it are the ones who believe in their goal and keep taking action, even when progress is slow.
It's all about consistency.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so he also talks about how important it is to track your progress by keeping a record of your weekly measurements. Your weight, your body fat percentage, your waist circumference, things like that. And he even provides a sample chart so you can see how to organize your data.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
It is. Okay, now let's talk specifically about lean body mass. The book advises you to pay attention to the trends in your LBM over time.
And he cautions people not to freak out if they see a slight drop in their LBM when they first start a program, especially if it involves reducing your calorie intake or cutting carbs.
Right.
Often that initial dip is just water weight being lost from the muscles themselves, not actual muscle tissue breaking down.
Yeah.
And remember, those standard body composition tests don't differentiate between water weight, muscle, and fat. So a slight decrease in LBM could just be a reflection of less water in your muscles, which is totally normal, especially when you're in a calorie deficit.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And the big takeaway here is that you need to pay attention to your body's feedback and adjust your program accordingly. Whether it's your cardio, your weight training, or your nutrition, it's about learning how your unique body responds to different things.
Right.
And eventually, you'll get to a point where you'll almost intuitively know what works best for you.
It's like becoming your own science experiment.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now let's talk about genetics. This is something that people often feel like they have no control over. But the book does a really great job of explaining how genetics influence your body composition and what you can do about it.
All right, so he introduces this concept of a genetic bell curve to illustrate that when it comes to losing fat and gaining muscle, most people fall somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that's right.
And these people will see results as long as they put in the effort with their nutrition and exercise.
Right. And then he points out that about 20% of people are what he calls above average genetically. They tend to lose fat pretty easily, even if their diet and exercise aren't always perfect.
Right.
You know, they seem to have a little more wiggle room than the rest of us.
Yeah. We all know those people, right?
That's fair.
All right. And then on the far end of the bell curve are what he calls the genetic freaks.
Those are the people who seem to just stay lean effortlessly no matter what they eat or how much they exercise. It's like they were born with a six-pack.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely know a few people like that, and it's incredibly annoying.
Totally.
But the book goes on to list 10 major genetic variables that can influence things like your metabolism, how easily you gain muscle, your strength, your athletic potential, your body type, all sorts of things.
Okay, let's go through that list. So the first one is your basal metabolic rate, or BMR. That's basically how many calories you burn at rest. And that can vary significantly from person to person. Then there's the number of fat cells you have, the length of your limbs, the circumference of your joints, where your muscles attach, the type of muscle fibers you have, your natural hormone levels, things like testosterone and growth hormone, how efficient your nervous system is, your cardiovascular efficiency, which basically means how well your heart and lungs work.
Right.
And then even aspects of your emotional profile, like how prone you are to stress and things like that, can come into play.
So it's a pretty comprehensive list. It really shows how much our genetics can influence our body composition. But here's the good news. The author has a really encouraging message for those of us who feel like we might not have the best genes. He says that success with fat loss is far from predetermined. You know, while your genes do play a role, you still have a ton of control over your results. He calls it playing a poor hand well.
And he suggests that if you feel like you're on the less fortunate side of that genetic curve, just accept that it might take a little longer to reach your goals.
Okay, so be patient and persistent.
Exactly. And be meticulous about your nutrition and your training. Really dial those in. He also says not to compare yourself to those genetic freaks who seem to have it easy, because that can be really discouraging.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so now let's talk about how to tailor your approach based on your body type. The book dives into different body types and their unique needs, focusing particularly on the endomorph.
Right. And for those of you listening who tend to gain fat more easily, the endomorph body type, the author stresses that having a strategic plan for your diet and exercise is super important. You can't just wing it.
Okay, so what's the endomorph strategy?
So it involves a few key things. First, you have to be really active, like consistently exercising at a pretty high level. Second, you've got to be super disciplined and consistent with your nutrition. And third, he recommends managing your carbohydrate intake, possibly by having more protein and fewer carbs.
Okay.
And he's very clear that exercise isn't optional for endomorphs who want to lose fat effectively.
It's got to be part of the equation.
Exactly. He says that just dieting, even if you're eating super clean, isn't likely to be enough on its own because of the way your metabolism works.
Okay, so what's the recommended combination?
Well, it's a balanced diet that's a little higher in protein and a little lower in carbs, paired with both weight training and regular cardio. You need all three working together for optimal results.
So it's not just about one thing, it's about the whole package.
Yeah, absolutely. And He also gives some great tips for staying motivated, which can be tough for anyone, but especially for people who might see slower results. This includes finding role models, working out with supportive friends or a trainer, using motivational tools, and even considering joining a fitness competition or challenge.
Those are all great ideas. And like the point he makes about how even though these challenges might seem like a disadvantage, they can actually help you develop valuable skills and traits like discipline, persistence, and mental toughness, which will serve you well beyond just your fitness goals.
Totally. He contrasts this with people who just have good genetics and might not ever have to push themselves as hard.
So sometimes our limitations can lead to our greatest strengths.
Exactly.
Okay, so now let's circle back to that fundamental principle that underlies everything we've been discussing, which is the law of energy balance.
Yeah, that's the foundation.
Right. And the book lays it out really clearly. To lose fat, you have to burn more calories than you consume. And to gain weight, you have to consume more calories than you burn. Simple as that.
Yeah.
And there's this really important follow-up point he makes. Excess calories from any kind of food, even those considered healthy, will ultimately be stored as body fat.
Right.
So if you're eating more calories than you're burning, it doesn't matter if you're eating organic kale and grilled chicken all day long.
Yeah.
You're still going to gain weight.
Absolutely. And this debunks those diet myths that say you can eat all you want of certain foods and still lose weight. That's just not how the human body works.
Right. And he also addresses those low-carb diets that claim calories don't count. He explains that while those diets can be effective for some people, they actually work because they tend to reduce your overall appetite and cravings, which leads to eating fewer calories.
It's not that they're somehow bypassing the laws of thermodynamics.
Right. So if calories are the bottom line, how do we figure out how many calories we actually need to be eating to reach our goals?
Well, the book breaks down the 6 major factors that influence your daily calorie needs. So the first is your basal metabolic rate, BMR, which is how many calories you burn just to keep your body functioning at rest.
Right, like breathing and all that.
Exactly. And that's usually the biggest piece of the puzzle. The book provides this quick and easy method for estimating your calorie needs based on your body weight and whether your goal is fat loss, maintenance, or gaining weight.
Okay, great.
And then the other factors that come into play are your activity level, how much exercise you get, the thermic effect of food, which is how many calories you burned digesting and processing your food.
Right.
Something called non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT, which is all the movement you do outside of formal exercise, like walking around, fidgeting, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, and then other individual factors like your age, your gender, your genetics, and your body size.
Right.
And the book goes on to explain that formulas that use your lean body mass are generally more accurate for calculating your calorie needs, especially if you have more or less muscle mass than average.
Okay.
But the main point here is that you've got to adjust your calorie intake to match your goals, whether that's being in a deficit to lose fat, a slight surplus to gain muscle, or just eating at maintenance to stay the same weight.
Right. And while it might seem like a lot to think about, it's really important to have at least a general understanding of how many calories you're taking in each day.
Yeah.
You don't have to count every single calorie forever, but having that awareness can really make a difference in your progress. Okay, so now let's talk about meal frequency. The book strongly recommends eating 5 to 6 properly structured meals spread out every 3 hours for optimal fat loss and muscle preservation.
Yeah, and he uses this really cool analogy comparing eating 3 larger meals a day to driving a Honda Civic and eating 5 to 6 smaller meals to driving a powerful Dodge Viper.
So both might get you where you're going, but
One is going to be much faster and more efficient.
I love that analogy. So what's the thinking behind eating more frequently?
So it's about keeping your metabolism running at a higher rate throughout the day.
Yeah.
When you eat more often, your body is constantly digesting and processing food, which takes energy.
So you're burning more calories overall.
Exactly. And on the other hand, when you skip meals, your metabolism actually slows down, which can lead to muscle loss and trigger those starvation responses we talked about earlier.
Okay, so skipping meals is a no-no.
Yeah, not ideal.
All right, so he also talks about how that starving and stuffing pattern, where you might skip breakfast and lunch and then end up overeating in the evening, can really backfire.
Oh, yeah.
Not only does it mess with your energy levels, but it can lead to storing more fat.
Because when you go too long without eating, your blood sugar drops, and then you end up feeling starving and craving all the wrong things.
So having those regular balanced meals is all about keeping your blood sugar stable and your energy levels up.
Exactly. And he even recommends having a set eating schedule, even on the weekends, to really solidify those healthy habits.
Okay, that makes sense. And for busy people who might be struggling to fit those meals in, he gives some really practical tips like packing your food in advance, having protein shakes ready as a backup option, and knowing what healthy choices you can grab if you're on the go.
Right. It's all about being prepared.
Totally. All right, now let's talk about food combining. This is something that a lot of people have questions about.
Yeah, so this is that idea that you should separate certain foods, like not eating carbs and protein together in the same meal.
Right.
But the author actually debunks this myth. He says that eating lean protein and complex carbohydrates together at every meal is actually the best strategy for maximizing both fat loss and muscle growth.
Okay, so what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, he lays out 8 scientific reasons. First, he explains that your body needs a regular supply of protein to maintain a positive nitrogen balance, which is essential for building and repairing muscle tissue.
Okay.
And the insulin that's released when you eat carbs actually helps your body transport those amino acids from the protein into your muscle cells more efficiently.
Interesting.
So it's all about maximizing muscle growth and recovery.
Yeah.
He also points out that eating carbs on their own can cause those rapid spikes and crashes in your blood sugar, which can lead to fatigue, cravings, and just feeling generally crummy.
So combining them with protein and fiber helps to slow down that digestion and keep your blood sugar more stable.
Exactly. And your muscles need carbs for energy. You know, when you restrict carbs or separate them from protein, it can deplete your muscle glycogen stores, which can negatively impact your workouts.
Okay, that makes sense. So basically, the takeaway is that eating a balanced meal with protein and healthy carbs together is the most effective approach.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's talk about nutrient ratios. The percentage of protein, carbs, and fats in your diet. The book touches on how these have been used in bodybuilding, and he specifically mentions the popular 40-30-30 zone diet.
Right. And he acknowledges that the zone diet did bring some good concepts to the forefront, like managing your insulin levels and the fact that everyone's needs are different.
Okay.
But he emphasizes that ultimately your total calorie intake is still the most important factor, overriding any specific ratio for losing fat or gaining muscle.
So calories are still king.
Yes, calories are always king. But the optimal nutrient ratio for you can vary based on your goals, your body type, and your individual sensitivity to carbs.
Right. And he provides a starting point of 50-55% carbs, 30% protein, and 15-20% fat as a general balanced approach for most people. But he also explains how you can tweak those ratios based on your specific needs.
Exactly. For example, if you're really focused on losing fat, you might slightly increase your protein and fat intake while reducing your carbs, especially in the evening.
Okay.
The key is to avoid those extreme diets, super high carb or super low carb, because those are usually not sustainable in the long term. He even offers a simple visual method called the 3-2-1 method, where you basically divide your plate into 3 sections: half for carbs, a third for protein, and the remaining sixth for fat.
Okay, I like that visual. Super helpful.
Yeah, it's easy to remember.
All right, so now let's talk about sugar and fat, those nutrients that often get demonized. The author shares his opinion on which he thinks is more problematic.
Okay, so he states that he believes excessive sugar and processed carbs are more to blame for the current rates of obesity and chronic disease than fat is.
Interesting. Okay, so what's his reasoning?
Well, he says that when we replace fat with sugar in our diets, it can actually create new problems with blood sugar and insulin levels because fat actually helps to slow down the absorption of carbohydrates.
So fat plays a role in regulating blood sugar.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he's a big proponent of managing your insulin levels for both fat loss and overall health. He also says that going on those very low-fat diets, like under 10% of your calories from fat, is not a good idea because we need those good fats for various bodily functions.
Okay.
But on the other hand, he also warns against those high-fat diet trends. He reiterates that your overall fat intake should be moderate, somewhere around 20 to 30% of your calories. He gives a bunch of reasons why high-fat diets might not be optimal for everyone.
Okay, so what are some of those reasons?
Well, he talks about the fact that fat is very calorie dense. You know, a tablespoon of oil has more calories than a cup of broccoli.
Right.
So it's easy to overdo it on calories when you're eating a lot of fat. He also mentions that eating a lot of fat can have negative effects on your blood lipid profile, you know, your cholesterol levels and things like that.
Okay.
And he points out that when you're eating a lot of fat, you might not be eating enough carbs, which are your body's primary energy source. And then there's also the issue of potentially getting too much saturated fat, which is generally not considered healthy.
Right. So he makes a clear distinction between saturated fats, unsaturated fats, and trans fats.
Right,
Okay.
exactly. Saturated fats, which are solid at room temperature, are generally considered less healthy. Unsaturated fats, which are liquid at room temperature, are the good fats.
Okay. And trans fats are just bad news all around.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the ones that are artificially created through a process called hydrogenation.
Host.